Lesson 2 for October 5 to 11, Nehemiah, read by Dr. Percy Harold. Sunday, October 6, Nehemiah receives bad news. The book of Nehemiah opens somewhat in the same way the book of Daniel did, as we read in Daniel 1, verses 1 and 2, and that was with bad news. And Daniel 1 verses 1 and 2 reads, In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar king of Babylon came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim king of Judah into his hand with some of the articles of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar to the house of his God. And he brought the articles into the treasure house of his God. Yes, many had returned to their ancestral homeland, but things weren't going too well for them there. Question, read Nehemiah 1, verses 1 to 4. Why was Nehemiah so distressed? What was his response to the bad news he received? Nehemiah 1, beginning at verse 1. The words of Nehemiah, the son of Hakaliah. It came to pass in the month of Chislev, in the 20th year, as I was in Shushan the citadel, that Hanani, one of my brethren, came with men from Judah, and I asked them concerning the Jews who had escaped, who had survived the captivity, and concerning Jerusalem. And they said to me, The survivors who are left from the captivity in the province are there in great distress and reproach. The wall of Jerusalem is also broken down, and its gates are burned with fire. So it was, when I heard these words, that I sat down and wept, and mourned for many days. I was fasting and praying before the God of heaven. Some Jews, taken captive years earlier, were brought to Shushan, one of the 4 administrative centres of the Persian Empire, where Nehemiah served in the royal palace as a cupbearer. The term used for Hanani, one of my brothers, most likely refers to a blood brother, because there is a similar but more familial-sounding reference to Hanani in Nehemiah 7 verse 2, although it could be a reference to just a fellow Israelite. The conversation with Hanani most likely happened between mid-November and mid-December of 445 BC, some 13 years after Ezra's return to Jerusalem. Hanani reports that the situation in Jerusalem is dire. The people have not been able to rebuild Jerusalem, and the enemy had destroyed the walls of the city, leaving it defenceless and desolate. It bears mention that King Artaxerxes crushed the hope of the returnees by stopping the progress of the construction after the people beyond the river complained, and we read about that yesterday in Ezra chapter 4. This allowed the enemies to destroy the walls of the city, as we read in verse 23. Now when the copy of King Artaxerxes' letter was read before Rehum, Shimshai the scribe and their companions, they went up in haste to Jerusalem against the Jews, and by force of arms made them cease. Nehemiah would have heard rumours of such disaster, but he didn't have definite answers until this time. Even though the temple was rebuilt, it wasn't fully functioning, because the people needed for the temple service were unable to live in Jerusalem. The situation saddened Nehemiah as the implications of the news penetrated his soul. The Jews had not glorified God even though they had returned for that purpose. Instead, they had neglected the house of God and the holy city because of their fear of the enemy and oppression. Thus, Nehemiah automatically turns to God. He doesn't complain that the people of Judah lack faith or put them down as cowards, nor does he just accept the situation as the status quo. Nehemiah just gets down on his knees and starts praying and fasting. And so to finish the day, at this bad news, Nehemiah wept, fasted, and prayed. What should this say to us about how we, especially in times of trial, need to appeal to the Lord? This week's lesson has been read by Dr. Percy Harold from Queensland, Australia. It is brought to you by Hope Channel, the Sabbath School Department, and through the services of Christian Services for the Blind. A video of this podcast also occurs on YouTube. Remember, God is always faithful.